My name is Paul Dennison. I work for the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks Department. Welcome to our presentation, Fire Doesn't Stop at the Fence, Cross-Boundary Wildfire Risk Reduction in Boulder's Wildland-Urban Interface. I'm joined by three co-presenters who I'll have introduce themselves in a moment, but to introduce you to the structure of the presentation, we're going to give an overview of the city's recent strategies in reducing risk in the Wildland-Urban Interface. We're going to talk about the partnerships and the perspectives that are important in accomplishing comprehensive or nearly comprehensive wildfire risk reduction. And then we're going to talk about a case study that's in a portion of Boulder County. It's a mobile home community that is adjacent to city managed land, but it's in unincorporated Boulder County. So that adds a dimension of collaboration that's important and that we wanted to highlight. But we also have other projects that, if there's time towards the end of the presentation, which we want to keep open for question and answer and discussion, I'd be happy to talk about how we're applying these methods and strategies in other parts of the city of Boulder. So again, my name is Paul Dennison. I work for Open Space and Mountain Parks. I'm the Wildland-Fire Senior Program Manager. I've been with the department for a little over 2 years. My position was created shortly after the Marshall Fire, and one of the responsibilities that I have is developing mitigation strategies that build on all of the land management that we do, forest thinning projects, agricultural management, ditch fuels work, and trying to weave those together into very targeted strategies directly adjacent to residential communities. And I'm joined, I'll turn it over to you, Jim, and my two other friends here who are going to talk about the other dimensions of wildfire risk management. Jim.
So I'm Jim Webster. I'm the Wildfire Mitigation Program Manager for Boulder County. But I don't work for Boulder County Parks and Open Space. I'm with our Community Planning and Permitting Department.
Thanks, Jim. Here.
Hi, I'm Kirin Riddell. I work for the Boulder Watershed Collective. We're a nonprofit that works within the Boulder Creek Watershed, so essentially the southern half of Boulder County with a little bit of spillover. Our mission is to cultivate partnerships, promote community stewardship, and revitalize social and ecological systems within the Boulder Creek Watershed. And a lot of that looks like projects that work on forest health, watershed health, and climate adaptation. And I work as a fire adaptive communities coordinator. So it ends up being a lot of kind of filling gaps between communities and agencies and other partners to develop projects and programs that help communities to move forward with wildfire adaptation.
I'm Aaron Kennedy. I'm the founder and CEO of Outway, which is a land management software out of the National Science Foundation's Innovation Corps program. After studying land management teams and collaboration on how do we use tools to actually bring people together and working locally in the field.
Okay, thank you. And does anyone in the room, is anyone unfamiliar with the concept of the Wildland-Urban Interface? Just curious if we have anybody who's brand new to fire management or wildfire risk management. Great, that saves me a little bit of foundational information. So to introduce the topic, we're all aware of the Wildland-Urban Interface, and this is an issue that open space programs need to grapple with. On the left, we have a map that shows the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks land system, and the purple, those are actually purple shapes. It kind of looks like a purple line, but that's our City of Boulder defined Wildland-Urban Interface in the built environment. So homes that have been determined to have some exposure to potential wildfire risks. And then on the right, this is a risk layer from the Colorado State Forest Service wildfire risk assessment. It's a burn probability layer, and I think it's actually an over-illustration of wildfire hazard, and it's certainly not the way I like people to think, or what I want people to think about first when they think about natural lands. But it does illustrate that as land managers managing land systems that are adjacent to residential populations, we do have this issue of wildfire risk management to contend with. Adding to that, in the past 5 years or so, there's been a very startling increase of urban conflagrations, or fires transitioning from natural areas into the built environment, spreading from home to home, causing massive loss of life, property, and posing very challenging and dangerous situations to firefighters. So these are where the two Wildland-Urban Interface sides meet and present a significant challenge and a great opportunity to pursue comprehensive wildfire risk management. So conventionally, or at least in my 12 or so year career, the way that wildfire mitigation has been conducted is fuels management in natural areas, and whether in our cases that's city managed lands or publicly managed open space systems, that we're responsible for developing strategies to reduce hazardous fuels. And ideally, that is complemented with homeowners who engage in their share of wildfire risk reduction. They create defensible space for firefighters to defend their homes and property. They harden their homes to be more resistant to damage or destruction in wildfire. The problem with each of these conventions as a standalone pursuit, this is a map that shows just one representative portion of the city of Boulder. These purple homes, these are all building footprints, homes in residential Boulder. The blue areas are our city land system, and these overlapping circles are 100-foot buffers drawn around those homes. So as you can see, the home ignition zone, which is a pretty narrow space, just 100 feet around homes, they overlap one another, they extend onto open space. So it's hard to look at a picture of risk in that very immediate Wildland-Urban Interface line and come to a conclusion about how to mitigate that risk without thinking in terms of land management that is very closely coordinated with work in residential communities, and even trying to merge the concepts of the home ignition zone, defensible space, home hardening, and trying to coordinate that more effectively with fuels management. We have this problem of overlapping home ignition zones. So a fuel hazard that may be in one person's zone 1 is also in their neighbor's zone 2, and it's hard to really draw a definitive line of where a hazard stops being an individual homeowner's hazard and it actually starts to look like a hazard that is shared across a community and shared between public managed lands and residential neighborhoods. So as I arrived in the city of Boulder and started working with many of our fuels management staff and our fire department and others, started to think, can we define a strategy that is less constrained by kind of the discouraging reality that if we even invest significantly in fuels management directly adjacent to communities, all that isn't all that effective unless we are able to at least motivate, but ideally help inform and be a part of project management that crosses boundaries. And our goal, and what I've been working on with partners such as the my three friends in the room, is not just thinking of fuels management as vegetation management, but also looking at built fuels, and then not just trying to develop projects that manage vegetation effectively and coordinate that with prescriptions to address these share hazards like fences and combustible materials on people's parcels, but also looking for opportunities to reduce risk in other ways, thinking of when we're implementing these projects, can we create better access points for firefighters or evacuation routes for residents. So trying to pack as much effective risk management into single projects that involve project teams with people who represent the community and opportunities for risk management in the built environment, people like Kirin who are deeply invested in social sciences and garnering community support and understanding community values, and then people like Aaron who are developing really creative mapping and land management and project management applications. So we're going to talk about our perspectives and then talk about how we're applying this new effort, this idea of establishing project perimeters that span open space into the built environment and look at vegetation, look at home hardening, and look at these other features of the risk profile of residential communities, and trying to get as much action in all of those fronts as we can. So Kirin, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your role in this kind of work.
Sure, I'll stand up. So one of the kind of first steps in figuring out how to move forward with this project was to figure out where we were going to start geographically speaking. Obviously we wanted to work with communities that were adjacent to open space and some level of wildfire risk to mitigate, but in considering the sort of relationships and dynamics in the community, Boulder Watershed Collective, this is a pretty common way to look at kind of levels of community engagement, but we see all of these levels as being valuable and sort of part of these relationships. But at the learner level, you know, you're looking at just sort of sharing information and contributor. Maybe people are giving you feedback via surveys. But moving into these kind of participant and partner levels is where we wanted to start with communities, because we wanted to work on a project that, you know, especially given that this is a pilot, we wanted to develop a project that we could implement and take somewhere and that would be impactful. And that is going to require a pretty significant level of community involvement and input, because we wanted it also to reflect community values and priorities and concerns. So as playing this role of kind of being a gap filler between communities and agencies and kind of connecting folks on this project, we wanted to look at starting with a community where maybe there was already some work being done, there was already a relationship that had started to be established, already some trust, and build from there as kind of a focal point. In the case of the case study that we're going to talk about, it wasn't actually us that had been doing work at Boulder Watershed Collective, or started a project there, but it was Wildfire partners who had already kind of developed relationships. And I'll let you talk about that next, Jim.
So we'll talk about the built environment now, and of course I'm in the planning, permitting, former land use department. So historically, you think about the building code and the land use code. Those are housed in the land use building departments. And so we have regulatory tools in terms of talking about the built environment. So we really started in 1989 with regulations looking at shake shingle roofs. And so that's where we started some of our mitigation efforts in our department. And then we expanded them to new homes, additions, eventually got to short-term rentals. So as a county department, you have the ability to regulate that land use, the building code. So that's where we restarted in the regulatory arena, and still have those programs. And more people are now figuring this out. We actually now finally have a state wildfire resiliency code. So what we did back in 1989, now all the areas of high risk around the county are going to have to adopt some minimum codes. But what we found after the 4 Mile fire in 2010, we were regulating new homes for 17 years. Well, only 10% of the homes in 4 Mile Canyon fire had gone through those regulations, right? The number of new homes is a relatively small percentage. So we really had to start working with the existing housing stock. So that's where we developed Wildfire Partners, which is the county's mitigation program. And the idea is we deal with both those new homes and those regulations within our department, but you also have to work with that existing, those existing homes. And so it's a large program. Don't have a chance to talk about it all today. WildfirePartners.org will tell you more. We'll talk about our Youth Corps program coming up here a little bit. We have community chipping programs, we have grant programs for strategic fuels mitigation, and rebate programs, but one program we're known for is the first parcel level certification program. So a fundamental problem out there is insurance, right? We have different people telling different folks what to do. On the one hand, the public sector is telling mitigate this way, private sector is giving different messages. But Wildfire Partners, we come together and get that mitigation recognized and rewarded with, you'll see the yard sign here that has a little sticker like a license plate where you update your certification. And that we've helped hundreds of people sort of obtain and maintain insurance. So we're going to talk a little bit about Wildfire Partners today, but mostly we're going to talk about some of our youth services programs. And if you have questions, we can talk more about some of the things we're doing, but really working with that built environment on the other side of the fence to get the homeowners prepared. Instead of, in the past, all the homeowners said, it's the land managers, just pointing the finger at the Forest Service and the open space. Those are the ones that have to mitigate. And we're really pointing the finger back at those homeowners and those residences. Hey, you've got to take ownership and prepare for wildfire.
All right, so I'm now transitioning a little bit from facilitator of the presentation and to try to bring the perspective of the roles that I'm playing in these new cross-boundary wildfire risk reduction initiatives. So my background is in fuels management and wildfire suppression. I came to the city from a rural fire district where I was the captain of our Wildland-Fire crew. So a lot of fire suppression assignments, and we were also a mitigation program. So more in the nature of that conventional approach to to fuels management, ridges and roadside fuel breaks, and that sort of projects. And for those of you that are contemplating more effective risk reduction wildland-urban interface, I want to share a few ideas that I have and then a few challenges that we're grappling with in the city of Boulder that I hope we have time to explore a little more further in question and answer and discussion. But one of the things that I encourage everybody embarking on fuels management project design to think about is what the measures of success are, or what are the conditions that we're trying to reach. So here on the right is as basic of a fire modeling bit of software as there is. It's called Compare4, and the QR code there can take you to a link, and it's on the handout that Aaron was distributing at the start. The reason I share it is thinking specifically about what the modifications we're making to vegetation or to fuels in the built environment, what outcome are we hoping to achieve? And in general, what people from a fire suppression background want to see is low intensity surface fire under most conditions. And I know that we're being challenged by climate-driven urban conflagrations and conditions that are very hard to engage in a suppression situation. But under most situations, can we try to manage vegetation in a way that brings fire behavior to something that firefighters can engage directly? And then, yeah, again, just thinking in terms of fire behavior modifications, but then also if you don't have a suppression background yourself, trying to engage in partners who work for fire districts or fire departments and trying to get the perspective of firefighters, ideally those who have seen homes burning down, to have the actual perspective on what makes a difference to home or community survivability and what also is going to make the most impact and in the most strategic locations to create opportunities for community defense. And some of the new challenges, particularly since the Marshall Fire, I think probably many of you and certainly us at the City of Boulder are trying to be creative and urgent about how to effectively manage risk in grass-dominant wildland-urban interfaces. So the case study that we'll talk about, the mobile home community, is mostly surrounded by grasslands and agricultural areas. So it's been a good area to test some of our new methods for management in grass-dominant landscapes. But as somebody who came from more of a fuels management in forested landscapes, grass has been really exciting but really challenging, as it probably goes without saying. It's a very dynamic fuel type. It grows back, so whatever you attempt to manage it, it's not a very durable treatment. So what's been very rewarding since I joined the open space department is working with plant ecologists, working with our agricultural specialists, and trying to achieve the target conditions we want to see in grass, so relatively short grass heights, but trying to achieve those when grass is most available to burn, and then trying to develop that into a year after year regime where we are managing risk but not inviting unintended consequences like weed invasion or anything else. So this is a picture of one of our recent targeted grazing projects in North Boulder, a different area. But grass is one of the big challenges that we're confronting, and it's been kind of an exciting frontier in wildfire mitigation and fuels management. Another challenge, especially thinking of risk in this cross-boundary way, is ember cast. I showed on our first slide a picture of our city-defined wildland-urban interface, and I can't remember what the factor of multiplication was, but recently when we redrew our wildland-urban interface, it increased significantly. And this is a reflection of trying to model and try to have good assumptions about how far embers could travel from the natural environment into the built environment. And I introduced it as a concept in vegetation management and trying to be thoughtful and deliberate about what we can do to manage fuels in natural areas to mitigate ember production into communities. But then also it's just another point of emphasis of the importance of the cross-boundary approach, that we can take reasonable efforts to manage vegetation and reduce ember loads to communities, but that really needs to be balanced with home emission zone risk reduction and other efforts in the built environment. And you can't totally guarantee success, or probably even come very close to anything like a guarantee when it comes to wildfire mitigation, So that just argues for working in a collaborative and as comprehensive of a way as possible.
To that note, collaborating as a system is often really challenging. And so from our NSF research, we studied over 500 different organizations from small towns through the federal agencies and nonprofits included. When you have these systems where every property is managed differently, it creates a ton of breakpoints in any form of a management strategy. So these points of collaboration are super important. We found that teams that did this successfully had a key of some best practices. And I think a couple of them are really important. Specifically, accessibility is more important than being really technically proficient. So if the majority of people involved in a project across a team can't use a tool, then it is not effective for you. You're missing the majority of input that you could be getting from the people who are collaborating with you. Centralized for collaboration, I don't think it's foreign to anyone in this room that almost every team or every organization is always locked into their own environment. Finding ways to work across that and create a home for your project is often the best practice, even if it's just for the term of the project. That way your team knows what's happening across these different agencies that we have up on this panel, but in any of these environments. Planning for change, oftentimes when something's coming out of a master plan or something big, if we think that we have it all figured out ahead of time, and then we get into the field and the tool is missing a key component or it's too comprehensive or anything else, if you're not adapted to change in that environment from a systems perspective, the tools that are holding your team and their work together can actually fall apart because they will have to break in order for you to get that new element included or excluded. Removing duplicate work. If you're doing paper forms or spreadsheets or all these different tools across different teams, if everyone's recording something differently, it is eating up so much more of your time than trying to find one way to record it together, even if that is just a spreadsheet and you're all in one place. Keeping yourselves from writing things down multiple times is often one of the biggest time sinks that we saw in that research. And then lastly, simplifying the workflows. Finding something that makes the individual work really simple and quick so that whether you're in the field doing it or on your computer after when you're pulling everything together, it is able to flow really fluidly across your teams, whether it's pulling that data from your partner who is doing a field assessment or trying to summarize a statistical analysis across all of your studies, whatever your project looked like. These are the 5 best practices that we saw through that research that we think were really important incorporating in a collaboration like this where you have multiple agencies working together every day.
So our case study is the Sans Souci mobile home community in south of the city of Boulder in unincorporated Boulder County. And as we alluded to, it was Jim Webster and his Wildfire Partners program who began work, and then we'll talk about how City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks and Boulder Watershed Collective and Aaron got involved in the project.
Yeah, a couple of key components to how this case study started. Our county has a program for mobile home communities in terms of providing assistance in a number of different sectors. And so some past research had been done, and we have identified 33 communities in our county. But we couldn't work with all 33. So we looked at some of our community wildfire protection maps, looked at some of the wildfire risk, identified some of the communities that were higher risk. And then you also need local champions, right? You need interest, spark plugs, ambassadors, folks. So looking at where communities are motivated or have some interest was another factor in how we ended up with Sans Souci. And another thing you need is a product. What are you offering? What services? We try to match. We have a lot of different programs in Wildfire Partners, but one of our programs is our youth services program that provide free assistance. A lot of you are familiar with youth corps that are working on trails and on open space. Well, we started having youth corps help elderly individuals, people who couldn't do their own mitigation, defensible space and things, offering that free service. So we thought it was a good match in Sans Souci, a high-risk community, right west of where the Marshall Fire started, so they weren't directly impacted by the Marshall Fire, but they saw it, so they were motivated, high risk. And then we had a service, a free service of youth, working with communities to get both skills, but then also to make a difference. So it was a good place to start, and that's how sort of the activities there began.
You want to talk a little bit about
what some of
in the first phase?
Right, in terms of youth corps, again, Teens Inc. Youth Corps, sometimes their very first job out in the field, some youth coming from Aurora and different cities, first time into the foothills or the mountains, and so they get their training, but we'll also doing all types of things, from whether it's weed whacking, we clean up debris, we bring in dumpsters, we call it accumulated life debris. Not junk, it's maybe some people might call it junk, but there's a lot of things that accumulate and that actually cause homes to build down. So these cause homes to burn down. So we brought the youth in as a really good fit for this.
So when I started thinking more seriously about this concept of cross-boundary wildfire risk reduction, I reached out to Kirin and her colleagues because I recognized this wasn't a job that an open space wildfire manager could accomplish alone. And Kirin and her coworkers encouraged me to be a little less ambitious than I was wanting to be. I wanted to go work in communities that didn't have any HOA, that had the most challenging characteristics, and to see what we could accomplish at a multi-parcel and cross-boundary into city open space land. And they persuaded me to start in high-risk environments, but to look to communities that already had good progress and good momentum underway. And so I wasn't aware of the work that Jim and his team were engaged in Sans Souci, but Kirin and the Boulder Watershed Collective were. So started looking at it, and it is in our kind of highest risk western portion of residential areas in Boulder. This map shows the red building footprints. There are 67 homes in the Sans Souci community. And we drew a planning area buffer around that. And you can see the extent in green of our city managed land system. But you'll also notice there's pockets of gray still in the natural areas that surround Sans Souci. So this presented another interesting dimension, that we were looking at our own responsibilities and risk reduction to the Sans Souci community and our grasslands adjacent. But we also wanted to see if we could develop prescriptions and persuade neighboring landowners to join in this effort. And in this second phase, after building on and integrating with the work that Jim and his team had started, we started looking at opportunities to expand from the community into neighboring private lands and our city-managed natural areas.
Yeah, this was pretty close to where I got brought in, and it was because we had all of these different stakeholders coming in, and we had to find ways to keep track of what's happening across the ground. We have different teams coming in and out with different perspectives across the project. Together we worked to try to find ways to make sure we're recording all of the information that's being captured, we're documenting the risk, we're documenting our relationships to these citizens on those parcel level pieces, and we're able to document the risk kind of across the community as a whole. And you'll see on the left there, that's what some of that data starts to distill down into, where we have key information and statistics across like what fuels we need to be working with, or key interest areas or takeaways that we have from individual parcel level assessments through zone 1 and zone 2 across that home level or home ignition zone study for this area. And then being able to also make sure we're not losing any of the work that's happening while we're still out there doing these assessments.
So the work that's been happening in recent months has spanned out, and we've had a lot of success engaging the neighboring landowners in more traditional fuels management prescriptions. But what I like about some of these photos, here's Wildfire Partners Youth Services, who were brought back in for phase 2 implementation. On the left there, I am literally talking across the fence, although I don't actually belong on either side of the fence in this picture. That's the neighboring caretaker who had an unmanaged bit of pasture, and we learned his barrier to managing that area of grass was the presence of too many large rocks and boulders. So just one part of the prescription for phase 2 was working with the youth services. He had heavy equipment but couldn't move all the rocks himself, so he was shaking those rocks up, getting them moved by the youth crews, probably not their favorite day of work in their careers. But since then, you can see the picture on the right. It's now getting grazed by his horses. He's able to mow it periodically and keep that in generally a very well-managed condition that would promote low-intensity surface fire. And that's about all I'll say about phase 2. As you can probably tell, we're trying to condense a lot of very complex parts that go into this concept of cross-boundary wildfire mitigation. But I want to make sure we have a chance to hear about programs for the open space departments you all represent and ask questions. So, Kirin, I don't know if you want to, well, sorry, there is a bit more I should say. What you were just looking at was our efforts in the natural areas and on open space land and private land. But I do want to highlight some of the work and the way that it was coordinated with open space. So again, these are the youth crews And this is work happening in the critical first 5 feet, which for many of these homes, given how closely together they're situated, those first 5 feet touch. So something that we've all been in agreement on and trying to achieve is really continuous treatment, and also trying to prioritize work that's directly on the perimeter where their community is exposed to city lands and then these other natural areas. So really effective and interesting collaboration happening amongst multiple landowners, and really good coordinated work with Jim's programs focusing on home hardening and risk reduction in the first 5 feet, and that's starting to really weave together with our strategies on city land. So Kirin, do you want to say anything about our next steps in Sans Souci?
Sure. One thing that I find often happens in projects like this is things don't always like go in perfect order. So now that we've already completed 2 phases of work, we've had the youth corps and all these partnerships, looking forward, we really want to start sort of working toward capturing a community scale sense of risk and an assessment of the risk, of wildfire risk in our project area, so that we can continue to develop work going forward. And one of the big challenges that Paul alluded to already is that, like many wildland-urban interface communities, there is a lot of shared risk in the home emission zones. Particularly in a mobile home community, homes are really close together. So in that 0 to 5 zone 1, you know, the risks are pretty contained to that home, but going out from there, zone 2, 5 to 30 feet, and zone 3, 30 to 100 feet, you're looking at shared risk for the whole community and the whole project area, including open space. So we decided to, you know, the risk at each home is significant to the whole community, and so we did want to capture a parcel level risk assessment, and we started with that just for the zone 1 for each home. And so the idea there is to get enough information to understand kind of where the common hazards are, what are the shared hazards, like for example, are 75% of these homes in need of new skirting, metal skirting to prevent ember intrusion? And if so, we can capture that and also know which homes they are to move forward with continued project planning. For zones 2 and 3, we didn't approach it as being specific to each parcel, but we looked at the zone 2 risk and zone 3 risks and hazards for the whole project area. So identifying those hazards more in the context of the project as opposed to like any individual homeowner. A lot of that looked like, particularly in mobile home communities, again, you know, storage is often an issue. People don't have a lot of indoor storage. So looking at, we saw a common theme was sheds that really needed to be mitigated to not be hazards for wildfire. And then moving out to zone 3, we also did, as Paul mentioned, want to look at not just like built environment and vegetation, but also understanding kind of broader community hazards such as, or considerations like egress. So knowing, you know, in this community there's only one way in and one way out. So understanding where there might be opportunities to develop projects to address that. Also things like access for first responders. The fence that Paul mentioned, not only the one that was between Sans Souci and a neighboring homeowner, it is a fence, the style of fence just collects a lot of vegetation over the years, or through the year, and so thinking of that as a potential for, you know, maybe we can work a project in that replaces the fencing so that it's not a hazard in and of itself. I could go into a lot more detail about kind of moving forward, but do you want to move on to
that was a great
questions?
detail.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to kind of highlight and echo something Jim said in the genesis of his program, that people perhaps used to have a tendency of pointing at open spaces and seeing that as the source of their wildfire hazard, and then I think there's an equal kind of misconception sometimes from land managers if this isn't all that effective if nobody does anything on their side of the fence. So it's the main idea I want to get across is that there is an opportunity to outgrow those ideas and to try to recognize share hazards and get effective work implemented. So I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and we have about 10 minutes left. So if any of you have questions for any of us, you can direct your questions at us, or we can decide who's best suited to answer. Yes?
So how do you balance, especially in tight communities like this, the need for fire mitigation with like a desire for shade or beauty? Like how do you talk about that? Because they don't have any space for plants, and if it's hot, they probably depend on shade for food.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start, and then Jim, if you have anything to add, please do. Most of the mature canopy within the community, it's deciduous vegetation, so it's less of a fire hazard in itself and more about management within the homing mission zone and the litter that those trees shed. But that is a salient consideration in many of the other parts of our wildland-urban interface, where the mature coniferous overstory provides shade, and that it's not just a comfort consideration, but it's critical for really human health and well-being, and not contributing to the warming that's already taking place in our climate. So, like everything else, there's a lot of balance in it, and it hasn't been a major point of friction in this project area, but it is something that is a difficult dimension of other project areas. Jim, does that come into consideration in your
In
portion
terms of the
trip?
county marking defensible space since 1993, over 5,000. I mean, up in the mountains, in terms of we move a lot of trees, and when we're doing the mitigation in more what we call the flats or the suburban communities, we're not removing a lot of trees. We're looking at pathways and vulnerabilities, and so we're moving mulch and we're looking at fencing. And there are service fuels. We have the Junk to Juniper campaign. We're junking thousands of junipers, so we don't like junipers next to homes. But there are, in terms of the number of trees removing in a lot of our suburban areas, it's relatively small. I mean, mature trees will remain. Sometimes there are ladder fuels with low limbing. There's a lot of things we can do in terms of mitigating the risk. A lot of people think we're clear cutting. In terms of when we say defensible space, we're clear cutting, removing all the trees in that first 30 feet, but that's not the case. There are trees remaining. We're trying to break up that pathway, and sometimes in the suburban areas, the pathway is the homes, right? In the mountainous areas, we don't want to remove thin those trees so that fire drops to the surface. We have challenges in the suburban areas because we're not removing homes, but sheds, RVs, there's a lot of things, accumulated life debris, what's underneath your deck. There's still a lot we can do. So it's not about tree cutting in many of these areas, it's about removing some other combustible materials and really, that mulch, those fences, that's what we're really focusing on, the juniper bushes.
Your question?
I was just gonna add that that's a piece where like having a good, close, trusting, working relationship with the community is really important too, because you can kind of co-create the strategies around that. Nothing is gonna be black and white or all or nothing, and that's where learning from the community can really help.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, what mutual awareness is there between this aggregate of partners and the efforts towards defensible space and safer communities, and what, say, energy companies are doing, updating their infrastructure, the money they're putting into their projects, removing old inactive infrastructure? It seems like these two things are acting towards the same benefits.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you probably noticed as Kirin was talking about all the future opportunities we see and all these other risk reduction elements that we want to build into the project design, it's almost limitless. And so like power line undergrounding or just vegetation maintenance on those transmission corridors, these are all things that I would love to see start to just be built into the envelope of a wildfire mitigation project. There's not, I'm actually now struggling to remember if there are transmission lines in San Souci. Is it along the highway?
The main transmission line entry point is in the northwest corner, at the top of the photo. Is where the power line entrance is to the little generator and water filter.
Okay. So none so far in phase 1 and 2, but that's a great question, and it gets at the spirit of trying to have as comprehensive of a prescription or a set of goals for these projects as possible.
Yeah, and to that point, like what I just said about the entry point there, that entry point is also across that CDOT corridor that is also one of the only riparian areas on the entire property. So it does change the profile of the bit as well.
Yes, Dan?
Yeah, Jim, so I know the county's got a rebate program, like up to $500. You get a home assessment, and here's the results of it, and here's $500 to help you implement that. And then this project goes further and it provides us the labor associated with helping to do that. I'm just wondering from your perspective, if it was minus the labor portion, if it was just the financial incentive, like how much participation would we typically get in an area like this if we didn't couple that with, and we're coming in here with labor as well?
So the great thing about mitigation is there's a lot of little things you can do into details. The classic is clean your gutters, or cut your grass. Those pine needles in terms of that fine fuel. And so people that don't have a great deal of money to buy, the number of people that need a new roof or new siding in our mitigation assessments is very, very small. That might be a long-term plan. But in terms of, we use financial incentives as little nudges to get people started, because people like something for free. But the idea is this is part of routine maintenance as a homeowner. These are things that you do regularly in terms of looking at those risks to an ember, that risk to surface fuels, and mitigating those. So there's a lot of things people can do without the resources. And that will be found in terms of it's a habit of ongoing maintenance. So we try to preach it's not something that's really costly necessarily. It's something, that RV and where it's parked and that maintenance and some of the other things in terms of moving that wood mulch are things that a lot of people can move their mulch without a lot of support. And they're doing it because they see the risk.
Yes.
I think this is the other thing to mention in terms of the post-Marshall fire, and we have folks from Louisville here. Once you have a fire, the level of engagement in the community and the concern and that risk really super elevates and people become engaged. It's hard to get people maybe involved if they've never been evacuated or never see a fire, but once you have a fire, there's a lot of interest, a lot of demand for this assistance, and a lot of pressure on open space departments as activity of, how can we reduce this risk? Because we're going to see a lot more fires in the future, and that's why we started our programs 15 years ago, because we looked out 10, 20, 30 years, and it's going to be a major issue in this state and managing open space in terms of how we deal with mitigation, and it affects both sides, the built environment side and the open space side.
Yeah, I was curious if the city has evaluated the Cherryvale area. I know there's generational grazing there. And I worked in those tall grass prairie sites, and I was wondering if you saw any fuel reduction and if it correlated with the amount of fuel fire intensity in that area?
Well, yeah, so are you asking about the Marshall Fire?
Yeah, the Marshall Fire,
So-
especially the Cherryvale area.
Yeah, I was on the Marshall Fire as a firefighter before I joined the city, and happened to be in that on the left flank of the fire, so in the areas you're describing, and that was really an inspiration for thinking about the nexus of agriculture and wildfire risk management, just how noticeable it was getting to in grazed pastures and hayed fields versus unmanaged grasslands. So I've seen it firsthand, and that's a whole separate, it's a portion of what we're working on in Sans Souci is trying to be more strategic about the timing and design of agricultural operations as they get closer to residential communities. And yes, it's certainly noticeable there, and I wish we had some of our plant ecologists in the room. I'm sure there were some studies, this was before I joined the city, but it was, saw it firsthand, and it made a major impact in fire behavior. Okay, it's 2:45. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining us.